Hello, this is Naila. I'm back for part 3 of modifiable risk factors, or more generally risk factors that are not genetic in nature. And as a reminder, these are peer-reviewed research articles that appeared on PubMed in August 2020. So we will go through 4 sub-themes today. The first is cognition and education as neuroprotective factors against AD, and there are 4 papers in this category. This will be followed by 5 papers on socioeconomic factors and social support. These actually overlap a bit with education. Then we'll have 7 papers on mixed factors and epidemiological studies. And lastly, we'll finish with 2 papers in the other category. So these are papers that didn't fit into any of the sub-themes from this or previous episodes.
Welcome to AMiNDR, a podcast where we summarize the latest publications on Alzheimer's disease for you, so you can spend more time doing awesome research. For every month, you'll find a series of episodes by theme, and each comes with a bibliography. Whether you're in the lab, on the bus, or cooking your meal, we hope you find this podcast useful and accessible.
So let's get started with cognition and education. And the first paper in this category was on what types of mental demands, particularly within jobs, affect cognitive function in later life, and also how genetics might play into this. This paper was published in the International Journal of Geriatric Psychiatry. The first author of this paper was Rodriguez, and the last author was Riedel-Heller, and there are quite a few authors in between those names. And the title of this paper is ApoE4 allele and mental work demands on cognitive decline in old age, results from the German study on aging, cognition, and dementia in primary care patients. And this is abbreviated to AGE-CO-D. The population-based AGE-CO-D study followed just over 2,100 cognitively healthy individuals aged 75 years and older in 7 assessment waves, in which the authors evaluated cognitive function using the mini mental state examination. After adjusting for education, gender, marital status, stroke, depression, and diabetes, the authors found that an occupational history of working in jobs with high compared to low demands of the following cognitive domains: language and knowledge, pattern detection, information processing, and service, was associated with slower cognitive decline. So, recap, having high demands of the mental tasks that I just listed equals lower or slower cognitive decline. ApoE4 allele carriers exhibited accelerated cognitive decline, but this decline was significantly slowed by having medium compared to low levels of mental demands, in contrast to non-carriers. These longitudinal observations suggest that intellectual enrichment or intellectually enriched lifestyles can slow cognitive decline, even in risk gene carriers, and that fostering intellectual engagement throughout one's life may help promote better cognitive health in old age. Switching gears more specifically to education, this paper examined the influence of years of education and the E4 risk allele on beta amyloid pathology and whether it is similar in asymptomatic individuals with a family history of sporadic versus autosomal dominant or familial AD. This was published in Neurology. The first author is Gonod and the last author is Villeneuve, and this is part of the Prevent AD research group and as well as the Diane study group. So this was a big collaborative effort. And the title of this paper is Association of Education with Amyloid Beta Burden in Preclinical Familial and Sporadic Alzheimer's Disease. And I'll refer to amyloid beta as A-beta, as I'm sure you've heard before as well. The authors analyzed cross-sectional data from 106 asymptomatic individuals with a parental history of sporadic AD and from 117 pre-symptomatic autosomal dominant AD mutation carriers. So again, they're comparing sporadic AD to familial AD. All participants underwent structural MRI and A-beta PET imaging, and the influence of years of education, ApoE4 status, and their interaction on beta amyloid PET was examined in each cohort. The authors found that asymptomatic individuals with a parental history of sporadic AD showed increased A-beta burden, which was associated with carrying the ApoE4 allele and with lower education level, but there was no interaction between these two factors. In contrast, there was no relationship between ApoE4 and A-beta burden in pre-symptomatic mutation carriers of autosomal dominant or familial AD, but increasing level of education was associated with reduced A-beta burden. There was a similar association between educational attainment and beta amyloid burden in both groups. This suggests a protective environmental effect that could promote brain resistance against pathology in both sporadic and familial AD, whereas ApoE4 allele increases the risk of A-beta accumulation in sporadic AD only. Next, we have a paper entitled Education and Cognitive Decline, an integrative analysis of global longitudinal studies of cognitive aging. The first author is Clouston. The last author is Richards, and this was published in the Journals of Gerontology, Series B, Psychological Sciences and Social Sciences. This study conducted secondary analyses of data from the Health and Retirement Study, a nationally representative prospective cohort study of nearly 30,000 U.S. residents. Specifically, the authors used Cox proportional hazard survival models layered on longitudinal mixed effects modeling to examine healthy cognitive aging and incidence of accelerated cognitive decline, particularly those consistent with preclinical Alzheimer's and related dementias. The authors replicated previous findings that education was positively associated with cognition at baseline and found that higher education was associated with delayed onset of accelerated cognitive decline. Replication analyses using data from 14 countries showed similar results, lending support to the cognitive reserve theory, which is the theory that education reduces risk of cognitive decline as seen in AD and related dementia. We have one more on education, but this one is specifically on how early life residence and school segregation has affected cognition in elderly African Americans. So this one was also published in the Journals of Gerontology, Series B, Psychological Sciences and Social Sciences. It was published by first author Lamar and last author Barnes. And the title of this paper is Relationship of Early Life Residence and Educational Experience to Level and Change in Cognitive Functioning, Results of the Minority Aging Research Study. Nearly 500 African Americans without dementia at baseline self-reported their state of birth, residence at age 12, and school segregation status. The authors used Census Bureau definitions of South and Northeast/Midwest to categorize early life residents and evaluated global cognition as well as 5 cognitive domains at baseline and annually over 7.5 years. They found that around 65% of Southern-born participants still lived in the South at age 12, and compared to Northern birth, this was associated with lower baseline global cognition and in all cognitive domains, but not cognitive change. A similar profile was seen for Southern residents at age 12, in which segregation experienced significantly modified associations with level of cognition. Specifically, participants residing in the South attending a legally desegregated school had lower baseline levels of cognition than their Southern counterparts who attended a legally segregated school, or their Northeast/Midwest counterparts attending either a desegregated or segregated school. You can check the paper for specifics on which domains of cognition were affected. The authors conclude that baseline cognition was poorer in individuals born and residing in the South, particularly in those who attended desegregated schools at age 12. That's very interesting, and I wonder what socioeconomic factors could potentially underlie that, which leads us nicely into the next section, which is on social support and socioeconomic factors. So to start out this section, here's a paper on how previous healthcare resource use could predict disease severity. This was published in Alzheimer's and Dementia, by first author Desai and last author Andrews, and the title of this paper is Disease Severity at the Time of Initial Cognitive Assessment is Related to Prior Healthcare Resource Use Burden. Previous research has shown that individuals with AD or related disorders, so this is abbreviated to ADRD, have increased healthcare resource use well before diagnosis. In this study, the authors wanted to assess the degree to which health resource use is correlated with disease severity at the time of initial diagnosis. They conducted a retrospective analysis of linked medical records and claims data for 3 cohorts: mild ADRD, moderate to severe ADRD, and controls without cognitive impairment. They found that both ADRD cohorts had significantly higher healthcare resource use than controls. The rates of hospitalizations, emergency department visits, potentially avoidable hospitalizations, and accidental falls were highest amongst the moderate to severe ADRD cohort. This suggests that healthcare resource use before an official diagnosis increases with disease severity and highlights the need for improved evaluation and management at earlier stages of ADRD. So really, this paper is more focused on shifting to an earlier diagnosis, I think, based on healthcare resource use than it is saying that it's a risk factor or something like that. But regardless, it leads nicely into the next paper, which seeks to address how Mexican Americans' underutilization of formal care services impacts cognitive decline in individuals with dementia, particularly with regards to the family support they receive. So this was published in Gerontologist by first author Rote and last author Marquides, and the title of this paper is Dual Trajectories of Dementia and Social Support in the Mexican Origin Population. The authors use 7 waves of the Hispanic EPESE, which stands for Established Population for the Epidemiological Study of the Elderly. So they use 7 waves of that series and trajectory modeling to characterize long-term patterns of perceived emotional and instrumental support and the effects this has on dementia. They found that elderly individuals living alone were more likely to have low rather than high levels of support. That makes sense. In turn, these individuals were also more likely to have increasing cognitive impairment and potentially even dementia. The dual trajectory of emotional and instrumental support with potential dementia revealed that those with increasing cognitive impairment had the highest probability of belonging to the low support group. Okay, that was a very roundabout way of saying if you have low support, you're more likely to have increased cognitive impairment. So in summary, Mexican Americans who live alone are less likely to receive social support and more likely to develop dementia. Another related study, this one is on how positive psychosocial factors such as self-efficacy and emotional support differ across ethnic groups and their risk for AD. This was published by Zahodny and Brickman in the Journal of the International Neuropsychological Society. And the title of this paper is Positive Psychosocial Factors and Cognitive Decline in Ethnically Diverse Older Adults. This longitudinal study set out to characterize prospective associations between positive psychosocial factors and cognitive decline. It also wanted to test for differential impact across racial and ethnic groups. Nearly 600 older adults, and this was a mix of non-Hispanic Black, non-Hispanic White, and Hispanic, completed cognitive and psychosocial measures from the NIH Toolbox and standard neuropsychological tests over almost 2.5 years. The authors controlled for baseline cognition, sociodemographics, depressive symptoms, physical health, and other positive psychosocial factors, and they tested for interactions between the positive psychosocial factors they were interested in and race/ethnicity. They found that higher NIH Toolbox friendship scores predicted less episodic memory decline, with 1 standard deviation increase in friendship corresponding to 6 fewer years of memory aging. I wonder what 1 standard deviation increase in friendship means. Like, how many more friends do you need to have to save 6 years of memory aging. Anyway, this association did not significantly differ across racial and ethnic groups, so that suggests that friendships may be important, well, I think they are important, for improving episodic memory trajectories among older adults from all 3 ethnic groups. So go out and make some more friends. This next paper shares some authors with the previous one, and it's part of the same larger research project, which is the Washington Heights Inwood Columbia Aging Project, or abbreviated to WICAP. This was published in Alzheimer's and Dementia. The first author is Avila, and the last author is Manley. And once again, there's a whole list of authors in between. And the title of this paper is Education Differentially Contributes to Cognitive Reserve Across Racial and Ethnic Groups. So actually, this one would have fit better into my previous subtheme. In this study, the authors collected MRI data from just over 1,500 non-Hispanic whites, which they abbreviate to whites, non-Hispanic blacks, abbreviated to blacks, and Hispanics, not non-Hispanic Hispanics. And the authors used mixed growth curve modeling to examine whether education level was associated with the effects of brain integrity markers. So this includes hippocampal volume, cortical thickness, and white matter hyperintensity volumes on memory and language decline across racial and ethnic groups. The results indicate that higher educational attainment attenuated the negative impact of white matter hyperintensity burden on memory and language decline. Education also reduced the impact of cortical thinning on the level of language performance for whites, but not for blacks or Hispanics, indicating differential effects by race and ethnicity. All right, we've got another one on education and racial/ethnic disparities. This one is entitled Educational Benefits and Cognitive Health Life Expectancies, Racial/Ethnic, Nativity, and Gender Disparities. This is by first author Garcia and last author Wong, and was published in Gerontologist. The authors used data from the Health and Retirement Study, dating from 1998 to 2014, to estimate how long people remain cognitively healthy by gender, ethnicity, and education. So for ethnicity, they had white, black, US-born, and foreign-born Hispanic adults, and for education, they had less than high school, and some college or more. They found that white respondents lived a greater percentage of their remaining lives cognitively healthy than their minority black or Hispanic counterparts, and this was independent of the level of education. Among respondents with some college education or higher, black and US-born Hispanic women exhibited the greatest increase in the proportion of total life expectancy spent cognitively healthy, so they profited the most from education. In contrast, white women had the smallest increase. There was also an increase for men, the highest being for black men with college or higher education, and the lowest being for US-born Hispanic men. The authors conclude that the cognitive benefits of education may be highest for black men and women, as well as for US-born Hispanic women. This leads us into the next section, which is epidemiological studies and studies looking at several factors at once. Before we jump into that, let's take a quick break.
Hey listeners, I'm here to let you know AMiNDR is recruiting. If you're interested in joining us, shoot us an email at amindrapodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Enjoy the rest of the episode.
All right, welcome back. I just want to remind you before I get started again that you can find all of these papers in our bibliography. You can sign up for that through the episode notes or by sending us an email. So this section is on mixed factors and more generally epidemiological studies. I have 7 papers in this section. So to start off, we've got one epidemiological paper on early onset dementia, which does include Alzheimer's type dementia as well. This was published in Psychogeriatrics by first author Awata and last author Kakuma. And the title of this paper is Prevalence and Subtype Distribution of Early Onset Dementia in Japan. This group conducted a multi-site, population-based, two-step study to clarify the prevalence and subtype distribution of early onset dementia and to determine what services are frequently used by individuals with early onset dementia. I'm going to refer to that as EOD from now on. Questionnaires were sent to over 26,000 candidate facilities in 12 areas, with a target population of over 11.6 million, to first assess which facilities had provided services for individuals with EOD in the last 12 months. Those facilities then received follow-up questionnaires to complete and to distribute to the target individuals with EOD to obtain more detailed information. The authors found that nearly 17,000 facilities had provided services to people with EOD, and just over 4,000 cases were identified from which more information was obtained. Based on this, the authors estimated the national EOD prevalence rate to be 50.9 over 100,000 population at risk, with the number of individuals with EOD in 2018 estimated to be 35,700. Just over 50% of these cases were Alzheimer-type dementia. This was followed by 17% that were vascular dementia, and the remaining cases consisted of various different subtypes. The dementia prevalence rate was similar to previous estimates in Japan, although the subtype distribution differed. Medical centers for dementia were the primary special health service that was accessed and are expected to continue being an essential service to provide quality diagnosis and post-diagnostic support for individuals with EOD. This next epidemiological study investigates subtypes of AD and risk factors within the Aboriginal Australian population. It was published in Alzheimer's and Dementia. The first author is Derrig and the last author is Radford, and the title is Mild Cognitive Impairment in Aboriginal Australians. This longitudinal study included a total of 336 community-dwelling Aboriginal Australians aged 60 years and older who completed a structured interview at baseline. MCI, so mild cognitive impairment, either amnestic or non-amnestic subtype, and dementia were diagnosed via cognitive screening, medical assessment, and clinical consensus, and associations between life course factors and baseline MCI subtypes were examined by logistic regression. The authors followed participants for 6 years to assess conversion to dementia. They found that amnestic MCI was associated with older age, head injury, symptoms of depression, and lower blood pressure. In contrast, non-amnestic MCI was associated with low education, unskilled work history, higher body mass index, and hearing loss. While some MCI cases got better over the 6 years, the majority either remained stable, developed dementia, or passed away. The study suggests that different socio-demographic and clinical factors underlie MCI subtypes, while the subtypes show similar patterns of conversion to dementia. So the risk of AD tends to be higher in low to middle income countries, and this next study sought to determine prevalence of dementia among retired folks in Parakou, which is a city in the north of the West African country Benin. This paper was published in Dementia and Geriatric Cognitive Disorders by first author Adukonu and last author Uendo, and the title is Prevalence of Dementia Among Well-Educated Old Age Pensioners in Parakou, Benin in 2014. This group performed a cross-sectional study in Parakou over 1 month, in which they recruited participants at 2 centers, the National Center of Social Security and the Public Treasury of Benin. They determined participants with cognitive impairment based on low scores on the brief version of the community screening interview for dementia, and invited them for neurological examination. Dementia diagnosis was based on the DSM-4-TR criteria, and the Hashinsky score was used to differentiate dementia subtypes. Over 440 retired people were included in the study, the majority of which were male, and the mean age was 65. The prevalence of cognitive impairment was 7.7%, whereas only 3.2% of participants were diagnosed with dementia, with Alzheimer's being the most frequent type, followed by vascular dementia. Based on a logistic regression model, the main factors associated with dementia diagnosis were older age, low fruit and vegetable consumption, and living alone. Overall, this study shows a low prevalence of dementia among retired older people in Benin, but the authors stress that better care is nonetheless required to reduce the burden of families as the population ages. And I meant the burden on families, not the burden of families. Next up, we have a paper which tries to take all of the various modifiable risk factors we've talked about to determine which reliably reduce AD risk and which act as preventative strategies. This was published in Alzheimer's Research and Therapy by first author Rolandi and last author Guetta. And the title of this paper is Estimating the Potential for Dementia Prevention Through Modifiable Risk Factors Elimination in the Real-World Setting, a population-based study. Previous estimates indicate that around 35% of dementia cases could be attributable to modifiable risk factors, but these did not consider the concurrent effect of non-modifiable risk factors and death. In this study, the authors sought to estimate by how much the dementia incidence could be reduced by eliminating modifiable risk factors while controlling for non-modifiable risk factors and for the competing risk of death. To do so, they had 1,100 participants from a population-based prospective cohort based in Italy who did not have baseline dementia and attended at least one follow-up visit. These participants underwent multidimensional assessment at baseline and after 2, 4, and 8 years, with the primary endpoint being dementia diagnosis within this follow-up period. The authors considered a whole bunch of modifiable risk factors, so pay attention here. There was low education, obesity, hypertension, diabetes, depression, smoking, physical inactivity, hearing loss, loneliness, heart disease, stroke, head injury, and lastly, delirium. The non-modifiable risk factors they included were age, sex, and ApoE4 genotype. They performed competing risk regression models to obtain subhazard ratio for each exposure, with death as the competing risk. So, within the study period, 111 participants developed dementia. And based on a multivariable model to determine the independent influence of each factor on dementia, the authors found that ApoE4, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and delirium were independently associated with increased dementia risk. In fact, the authors estimate that 40% of the dementia cases they saw could be attributable to preventable comorbid diseases, and that preventative intervention should be targeted to these clinical populations to reduce the incidence of dementia. So they also encourage that further studies like this are conducted to see how generalizable their results are. Here's another paper on a mix of risk factors. The title is Predictors of Heterogeneity in Cognitive Function, ApoE4, Sex, Education, Depression, and Vascular Risk. It was published in the Archives of Clinical Neuropsychology. The first author is Macaulay and the last author is Keller. The authors used structural equation modeling, which is SEM, to simultaneously examine the effects of multiple modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors on specific cognitive functions in cognitively normal older adults. So for modifiable risk factors, they looked at education, depression, and metabolic or vascular risk, and their non-modifiable factors were age, sex, and ApoE4 allele status. The hypothesized models provided an adequate fit for the data in which cognition, depression, and vascular risk differed by sex. On average, men had higher vascular risk with generally lower cognitive performance than women, whereas women were more likely to have depression. ApoE4 status was not related to age, sex, or metabolic/vascular risk, but it did associate with depression, which in turn associated with lower executive attention, memory, and language performance. The authors list other associations based on metabolic and vascular risk, age, and education, but I encourage you to check out the abstract and paper for more details. Overall, the combined risk factors accounted for 16 to 47% of the variance in the cognitive domains, and the authors suggest that precision medicine approaches that integrate neuropsychological services could improve both the diagnostic accuracy and earlier identification of those at risk of cognitive decline. Next, we have a paper that seeks to address the fact that AD arises from a complex interaction between environmental and genetic risk factors, but this time it's using a mouse model which combines mild traumatic brain injury, or MTBI, and a mutation in the amyloid beta precursor protein gene, so the APP gene. It is called Gene-Environment Interaction Promotes Alzheimer's Risk as Revealed by Synergy of Repeated Mild Traumatic Brain Injury and Mouse APP Knock-In. It was published by first author Chiasser and last author Strittmatter in the journal Neurobiology of Disease. The authors use an APP knock-in model of AD, which leads to minimal disease phenotype without an added environmental factor. To investigate the interplay of this gene mutation with MTBI in Alzheimer's pathogenesis, they subjected anesthetized 4-month-old knock-in and wild-type mice to repeated mild closed head injury once daily for 14 days. For sham controls, they used anesthetized, uninjured, genotype and age-matched mice. The expression of amyloid beta, phospho-tau, and IBA1 was assessed in the injured cortices at 3 and 8 months post-injury. The authors found that the closed head injury enhanced neuroinflammation and the accumulation of amyloid beta and of hyperphosphorylated tau inclusions in the APP knock-in mice. It additionally exacerbated cognitive deficits as measured by novel object recognition and Morris-Water maze tests. These findings demonstrate that combining genetic and environmental risk factors provides a more robust model of AD, and that repeated MTBI substantially accelerates AD pathology in genetically vulnerable mice. I was always interested in the interplay of genetic and environmental risk factors. For my PhD, I studied a genetic mouse model of Parkinson's, and we also had considered maybe doing like a toxin exposure or something, which would have been really interesting, but personally, I think I'd have a hard time doing something like a head injury study, although I understand it's important. Anyway, moving on. This paper leads nicely into our last paper in this section, which ties everything together. So it attempts to address the complexity of studying AD risk factors as a whole, rather than focusing on the specific parts. So the authors apply systems thinking to map out various risk factors and causal mechanisms of sporadic AD, ranging from intracellular to psychosocial scales. I can't say I fully understand the methods of this paper, but I have to say I find it really cool. So this was published in Geroscience. It is a quite big collaboration, but the first author is Kuhlmann and the last author is Old Rickert. And the title of this paper is Mapping the Multi-Causality of Alzheimer's Disease Through Group Model Building. So this study reports on the first systemic causal loop diagram for AD, the result of an interdisciplinary group model building process, so a GMB process. The authors based this GMB on the input of experts from multiple domains and ensured that all proposed mechanisms were supported by scientific literature. Based on this input, the resulting causal loop diagram shows the interaction and feedback mechanisms that may contribute to cognitive decline from midlife onward. The authors observe several reinforcing feedback loops involving factors at multiple spatial scales, which are rarely considered within the same theoretical framework, and hence not in the same research fields. They also observed a significant role for modifiable risk factors. This included social relationships and physical activity, and it suggests that these may be promising leveraging points for interventions. These findings illustrate how a causal loop diagram based on an interdisciplinary group model building process could lead to new insights in deciphering complex disorders such as AD. And this could also be used to develop a computational model for simulating the effects of different risk factors on AD. And the reason I find this so cool is that I'm really into interdisciplinary work and more big picture stuff and trying to link the different scales of research and sort of increase the conversation and knowledge translation between different scales of research. So I find this kind of work really interesting. All right, so that brings us to the last two papers of the episode. These are in the other category because they didn't fit into my other sub-themes. I believe in a previous modifiable risk factors episode, I've talked about different toxin exposures. So this first paper is on a toxin exposure. Specifically, it's benzoapyrene, or BAP, and that's a hydrocarbon that's found in coal tar, tobacco smoke, and several foods, and could potentially lead to AD. So this was published in the Journal of Neuroinflammation by first author Liu and last author Zhu, and the title is Benzoapyrene Exposure-Induced Neuronal Loss, Plaque Deposition, and Cognitive Decline in APP/PS1 mice. And I might be pronouncing benzoapyrene wrong, so look up BAP if you're interested in it. So in order to investigate the effects of BAP exposure on AD progression, the authors administered BAP or a vehicle to 4-month-old transgenic APP/PS1 mice, or to their wild-type litter mates for 2 months. So after 1 month of BAP exposure, mice were tested for learning and memory ability and exploratory behaviors, and the brain tissue was examined for A-beta pathological and biochemical alterations. The authors also conducted gene expression profiling to identify mechanistic pathways, and immunohistochemistry and Western blots were used to evaluate neuronal loss and neuroinflammation in the cortex and the hippocampus. BAP exposure resulted in a progressive decline in spatial learning and memory and in exploratory behaviors in both the APP/PS1 mice and the wild-type mice, with the deficits being more severe in the former, so in the transgenic AD model. BAP exposure additionally caused neuronal loss, A-beta burden, and plaque formation in the transgenic but not in the wild-type mice. This was accompanied by alterations in genes and pathways related to inflammation and to immunoregulatory processes, A-beta secretion and degradation, and synaptic formation. Both wild-type and APP/PS1 mice exposed to BAP exhibited microglia and astroglia activation and upregulation of inducible nitric oxide synthase, glial fibrillary acidic protein, which is GFAP, and NADPH oxidase. These are 3 widely used neuroinflammatory markers, and so these were all upregulated in the cortex and hippocampus. The authors also tested more mechanistic questions in neuron glia cultures, but you'll have to check that out for yourself. So moving on, the very last paper was published in Nature Communications by first author Beckman and last author Schat. And this paper is called Multi-Scale Causal Networks Identify VGF as a Key Regulator of Alzheimer's Disease. The authors constructed multi-scale causal networks on a large human AD multi-omics dataset, which integrated clinical features of AD, DNA variation, and both gene and protein expression. The resulting probabilistic causal models allowed for the detection, prioritization, and replication of high-confidence master regulators of AD-associated networks. The top predicted regulator was neuropeptide precursor VGF. When the authors overexpressed VGF in 5X FAD mice, so that's another AD mouse model, they found that this partially rescued beta amyloid-mediated memory, impairment, and neuropathology. So their findings suggest that VGF plays a neuroprotective role in AD pathogenesis and progression. And if you found that paper interesting, I encourage you to check out the Genetic Risk Factors episode, which is hosted by Joseph this month. So that wraps up my modifiable risk factors for August 2020. Finally, that was 3 episodes. If you haven't checked out part 1 and part 2, I encourage you to do so. And I'll be back soon with non-pharmacological approaches to treating AD. See you then.
That's it for this episode. A huge thank you to the team that is working on sorting, summarizing, and scripting these abstracts. as well as the operations behind AMiNDR. The music is from Journey of a Neurotransmitter by Anusha Kamesh, musician and fellow scientist, and now member of the AMiNDR team. You can find the original piece and her other music on SoundCloud under Anusha Kamesh or on her YouTube channel, AK Music. Interested in joining the team? Give us a shout! We can always use help with content development, podcast editing, advertising, and you can be part of a new and exciting venture. Reach us by email at aminderpodcast@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter. Oh, we're also on Facebook now. Don't forget to subscribe to our mailing list if you want access to the bibliography for each of our episodes. The references come with timestamps. Timestamps. So you can more easily locate the paper that caught your interest. Check our notes below for details on how to sign up. And very close to this, you'll also find a link to our feedback survey. Because, your feedback matters to us. So please, pretty please, let us know how we can make this podcast a better tool for you. And last but not least, thank you for tuning in with us. And on this note, we hope you found our podcast useful and accessible. Until next time.